So, I told you we were going to have an interesting message tonight, didn't I? What have we been talking about? The book of Acts. We've been through the first 6 chapters. Tonight we're beginning the 7th, and we will go all the way from verses 1 to 2. We're going to speed it up. I'm going to give a little tiny bit of a review from last week with regard to where we've been, as I think I need to open up your eyes a little bit to the reality of the times that Stephen was living in, and I expect that some of this will shock you. And I'm taking the time to do this again at the beginning of a chapter, because at the beginning of the chapters, sometimes there's things that you need to know that you don't, and we're trying to approach all of this from a first century, Second Temple perspective. Yes? In the final words of chapter 6, we found Stephen with a face like an angel, and he was standing before the Sanhedrin. There was a mob of angry, ugly Jews who were all over his case, wanting to lynch him for supposedly blaspheming Moses, for supposedly blaspheming God and the temple. But they couldn't compete with his wisdom because he was speaking through the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. So let's begin with Acts 7:1 and read this together. The Kohen Hagadol, that's the high priest, who at that time was Caiaphas, asks, "Are these things so?" In other words, are all these things you said so? That are being said about you so is what I mean. Well, if you read Acts 7, you'll see this long, drawn-out response to that question. And he could have just said, no, they're not true. Well, why didn't he just say no? Well, the false accusers, the fake news people, remember, were from a local synagogue, and they were the ones who were claiming that he was blaspheming Moses. And that's because their traditions, their oral Torah, we've talked about that, were rabbinical interpretations of the written Torah of Moses. And what Stephen said was an assault on their traditions. Now, we've spent a lot of time learning about the synagogue in New Testament times, but we also need to know the nature of Judaism as a whole at this point in time. Now, before Babylon, Jewish life and religion got direction from where? The temple. And who ran the temple? The priests. And they were Sanhedrin, Sadducees. Who are they? Sadducees. They're the ones that made the rules. At that time, it was the only source of direction. You understand? Before Babylon. It was the priests and the Levites. It was their job to teach the people the laws of Moses and also to enforce it. It was to be followed by all the Hebrews, all of them. since it was given by God at Mount Sinai to all the Hebrews. That's all 12 tribes plus the Levites. However, around 700 years prior to Yeshua, 10 of the 12 tribes were sent into exile for their disobedience. They're called the northern tribes. The tribes that were formed, the 10 tribes that were formed, that, as I just said, was the northern tribes, were scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. Most assimilated into the world of the Gentiles throughout the vast Asian continent, and some were sent into North Africa. What remained of the Hebrews in the Holy Land was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, most of the tribe of Benjamin. But soon, the Benjamites, the Benjamin tribe, assimilated into the tribe of Judah. The name that was given to the people of Judah was Jews. Original, huh? And soon, they too would be exiled from the Holy Land. Only for them, they went directly to Babylon. Now, the Babylonian conquest meant the destruction of Jerusalem and what went with it? The temple. So therefore, it was also the end of a functioning priesthood as God ordained. The Torah and Moses was soon replaced with a mixture of the Torah and these new traditions. But it was only applicable to the tribe of Judah at this point. You ever think about that? Nobody else was there. So this new hybrid religion became the basis, you ready for this one? Of Judaism. Judaism. And the Jews at that time actually referred to their religion as, Judaism. It wasn't until much later that it became Judaism, just so you know. It actually was centuries. So to be clear, and then we're going to move on, this hybrid religion of Torah and tradition, whose home foundation was the synagogue, a religion that was called Judaism, it was that Stephen offended. Remember that the temple, this is important to hear this part, remember that the temple and the Sadducees denied the validity of what the synagogues were teaching. They denied it. They denied what they believed in. And they demanded adherence in the synagogues to traditions or, again, oral Torah. So you understand why there was a friction, to say the least. So in mainstream Christianity, you regularly hear the claim that Stephen was distancing himself from the law of Moses. You hear that often. And from the culture of the Jews. But was that true? Well, the very next verse, verse 2, immediately answers this question. Let's read it together. Stephen declared, "Brothers and fathers, listen, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran." Well, Stephen makes it clear that he regards himself as one of them. Yes? and they remain a part of him. He is in no way separating himself from the Jews of Judea. And from here he goes on to recall their entire heritage. And as I said, this is a long no answer, okay, when you actually read it, which we're not going to do tonight. That all the Jews know starts with Abraham, whom he called our father. He wouldn't have said our father if he wasn't still identifying himself as Jewish. Okay, so now I need you to pay close attention to this. If we can read this together. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. He said to him, "Leave your country and your relatives and come here to the land that I will show you." Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, remember that sentence, from there, after his father died, God moved him to this land where you now live. That's Acts 7, 2 through 4. It's important to note that everything that Stephen is quoting about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph is theoretically taken directly from the Torah. But if we check the Torah, if we check some of the details that Stephen quotes in Acts, they don't line up. They're not even close. In Acts 7:4, Stephen says that during the time Abram was living in Haran, his father died, and God told him to move to the land that he would show him, which is Canaan. Okay, so let's look at some scripture. In Genesis 11:26 says that Abraham's father, Terah, was 70 when Abram was born. Let's read that. Go ahead. Terah lived 70 years when he fathered Abraham. That's Genesis 11:26. So remember some numbers. You might have to go back and watch this again to put it all together. And Genesis 12:4 says that Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. So let's read that so you understand and hear it. It's pretty simple. Now, Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Remember, I said to you, remember that after his father died, God moved him to the land that he would show him? Yes, remember that? Okay. So if Terah was 70 when he fathered Abraham, or Abram, and 75 years later was when he died, then Terah should have been 70 plus 75, 145 years old when he died. Yet the Tanakh, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, says this. Let's read it together. Terah's days were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Whoa. One of these numbers has to be incorrect. But which one? So this is our first clue about something. The Samaritans had established not only their own temple, but their own priesthood. And they also modified the Torah in some ways to match their traditions. And one of the ways they did this was to change Genesis 11:32 to say 145 years instead of 205. In other words, they decided that there was an error in the math, and so they corrected it in their Torah. Does that surprise anyone? No? How many does that surprise? That they corrected their Torah. In other words, Well, let me just say this. The Sanhedrin to whom Stephen was speaking would have, pay attention, immediately noticed that mistake. You know, they memorized the Torah. And here he's saying 145 years, and they know it's supposed to be 205. What's going on? This would have told them something about Stephen that infuriated them. Infuriated them. Stephen was quoting from the beloved Samaritan Bible. Yikes. The Samaritans were loved, right? Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Well, let me jump ahead a little bit just to keep the train of thought instead of getting mixed up with a lot of stuff in between. Let's read Acts 7:14. So Joseph sent and called for Jacob and all his relatives, 75 persons. Here we have Stephen saying that Jacob and all of his relatives went down to Egypt to meet Joseph, all 75 of them. However, the Hebrew Tanakh, the Old Testament, says this in Genesis 46:27. Together, the tally of all the people belonging to Jacob's house who came to Egypt was 70. Ooh, wait, another mistake, right? Was it? Well, remember that I had pointed out I think it was last week, that Stephen was a Hellenist. He was a Jew from outside the area, or a Greek Jew. He came from somewhere foreign. Was Stephen perhaps from Samaria? Could he have been a Samaritan? One of the disciples? Let's read Acts 7:15 and 16. Let me start because I forgot the internet is not hearing you. Jacob went down to Egypt and died, he and their fathers. They were carried to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So here Stephen says that the place that Abraham bought for a tomb for his family was in Shechem, and he bought that tomb from Hamor of Shechem. But the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, says something different. Let's read it together. Then he charged them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite as a property for burial. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah. And there I buried Leah. The field was purchased along with the cave in it from the sons of Het. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. The point is that the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, says that Jacob was buried in the same cave that Abraham buried Sarah, and that cave was bought from Ephron the Hittite, and it was near Hebron, not Shechem. So why the glaring discrepancies on these details? You think Stephen was a poor student of the Bible? You think he didn't pay attention in geography class? No. The Samaritan tradition was that Abraham bought the cave from Hamor and buried everyone near Shechem, not Hebron. Why this different tradition? Because Shechem was in Samaria and Hebron was in Judea. Stephen was simply quoting the Samaritan tradition about this. Why else would he do that if he wasn't a Samaritan? So I would say that it's nearly certain that Stephen was a hated Samaritan. How many of you are surprised? Nobody? How many of you are surprised? You wouldn't even think that. I mean, you wouldn't pick up and go, I'm going to go really tick these guys off, and I'm going to quote all the stuff from the Samaritan Bible so that they can kill me faster. He wouldn't have done that on purpose. I would say that it's pretty certain that he was a Samaritan who had practiced the Samaritan religion before he became a believer. He was just probably a Jew who grew up in Samaria from birth. So he taught the Samaritan traditions. He was taught the Samaritan traditions. And he didn't even know, most likely, that the Hebrew traditions were different. He found out real quick, but he probably didn't know at that moment. And once it became clear to his accusers from the synagogue that he was, in fact, coming and quoting and speaking from the Samaritan Bible, he was a dead man walking. So let me close this evening with this. To them, Stephen being a Samaritan was why the men of the synagogue were crazy and they reacted so irrationally. In their mind, Stephen's Yeshua had promised to destroy their temple. And the issue of the temple was a very sensitive issue because the Samaritans had a rival temple at Mount Gerizim. And the Samaritans thought that the Jerusalem temple was illegitimate. And the Sanhedrin thought the same vice versa about the Samaritan temple. So this was a hot topic. And here this disciple comes out and starts quoting to them. He said the wrong things. And that's why, in my opinion, they were so hot to kill him so quickly. They were mad at a different level. We good? Surprising message? We'll continue next week.